America isn't gradually drifting into a middle-class crisis. It's crashing straight into one. When a household earning $100,000 a year still ends up in the red every single month, when a health insurance plan jumps from $59 to $798 and then past $1,200, when rent devours half your take-home pay, that's not a sign the economy is cooling off. That's a system cracking in real time, right in front of everyone. But the headlines keep repeating the same comforting script. Everything's fine, everything's improving. Meanwhile, 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Prices aren't dropping, wages aren't rising, and the so-called American dream is turning into a math problem nobody can solve. This isn't a distant warning. The middle class is disappearing right now. And the first blow came from a narrative that's everywhere: things are getting better. It sounds reassuring, until you look at what families are actually paying. The statistics used to tell this optimistic story are built to hide the reality on the ground. When the government claims inflation is 3.2%, it ignores shrinkflation, hidden fees, skyrocketing insurance premiums, service surcharges, and the most obvious truth of all: prices never returned to pre-2020 levels. Milk jumped from $2.99 to $4.79, and it stayed there. That permanent increase doesn't even show up in official metrics. Policymakers celebrate, but the cost of living is rising far faster than wages. Over the last 5 years, incomes have climbed around 14%. Yet essential expenses have surged anywhere from 40% to 120%. The economic path that once allowed people to build a future has flipped upside down. Wages inch forward, while everyday costs shoot up like a rocket. That gap, between the numbers on paper and the reality in people's lives, is what fuels so much frustration. And the closer you examine the data, the more obvious the illusion becomes. Housing is categorized as a flexible expense, so the index barely reflects the fact that mortgage rates jumping from 3% to over 6% have doubled monthly payments. Health insurance premiums exploding from $59 to $798 or even beyond $1,200. Softened or ignored. Energy bills rising even as consumption falls? Treated like a rounding error. Every essential cost is watered down in the models used to declare the economy strong. That's not an accident. That's the system hiding its own decline. If the data reflected what families actually face, leaders would be forced to admit the truth. The crisis isn't about poor budgeting or lack of discipline. It's that core necessities are rising at a speed the middle class simply cannot keep up with. And that illusion matters. It makes millions of families' struggles look invisible. Their situation has nothing to do with laziness or bad choices. It's the product of an economy presenting a mirage of recovery while every bill tells a different story. Nowhere is this disconnect clearer than in housing, because numbers can be massaged, but the price of a roof over your head can't. Reports claim inflation is slowing, yet nothing in daily life feels easier, and housing is the reason why. Since 2020, home prices have jumped about 55%. Wages haven't come close. And the real killer isn't even the sticker price, it's the borrowing cost. Mortgage rates rising from 3% to 6 to 7% don't just make houses more expensive. They double the total cost over the life of the loan. A $400,000 home today effectively costs around $650,000 once interest is added. So even high-earning households find themselves priced out, not due to financial mismanagement, but because the math no longer works. Renters aren't spared either. A basic one-bedroom that used to be $1,200 is now $2,000, sometimes $2,500. After rent alone, what's left? For households bringing in $3,000 to $3,500 a month after taxes, half their income vanishes into housing before they even touch food, insurance, transportation, or utilities. At that point, no clever budgeting trick, no overtime, no side job can fix a problem that's this fundamentally unbalanced. You can't work harder to beat numbers that are structurally impossible. And new construction isn't saving anyone. Developers focus almost exclusively on luxury buildings because that's where the profit is. Entry-level homes, the modest starter houses that once anchored the middle class, have practically vanished. In many cities, tiny 750-square-foot homes list for over $600,000, and somehow that's become normal. The American dream didn't vanish because people stopped trying. It vanished because access to the starting line has become unrealistic. And all of it stems from that original illusion. As long as official statistics insist everything is fine, even while housing eats up 40 to 60% of a paycheck, people eventually realize the truth. The problem isn't individual. It's systemic. And there's one area where this collapse becomes impossible to ignore: healthcare. When rent, groceries, and wages are already working against families, medical costs become the breaking point. That's the moment the idea of a recovering economy completely falls apart, because no expense in America rises faster, hits harder, or destroys financial stability more easily than a medical bill. You can skip a vacation, cut back on eating out, even cancel a few subscriptions, but you can't postpone getting sick. And that's exactly why healthcare has quietly become the most dangerous pressure point crushing America's middle class today. Over the past few years, insurance premiums haven't just become expensive, they've reached levels that simply don't make sense anymore. Families have watched their monthly payments skyrocket overnight, jumping from $59 to $798, then to more than $1,200 during open enrollment. And the wildest part? Their coverage didn't get better. The only thing that changed was the bill. Deductibles have also crossed a threshold no one ever expected. We're talking about $6,000 to $12,000 per person before insurance kicks in at all. At this point, it doesn't feel like a healthcare system. It feels like a toll booth you have to pay just to survive. Think about a family paying $1,500 a month for insurance. That's $18,000 a year, just for the privilege of being billed even more if someone ends up in the hospital. Add a few kids to the picture and their annual exposure can hit $40,000, sometimes $50,000. These numbers are totally disconnected from what the average American household actually earns. Prescription drugs follow the same pattern. Technically, many medications are covered, but when people get to the pharmacy counter, the co-pays are still in the hundreds, even the thousands. A basic treatment can cost $800 or $1,200 despite having insurance. And instead of helping, insurers add more restrictions, deny claims, invent new loopholes, anything to push the cost back onto patients. Yet we're told the same reassuring line: healthcare costs are stable. But that's simply not true. They only look stable because people are skipping appointments, delaying treatments, rationing medications, or avoiding care altogether. The illusion of stability is just untreated illness piling up in the background. And this ties directly into everything else we've talked about. When housing, groceries, and everyday expenses already swallow every dollar a family earns, healthcare becomes the final blow. At that point, it isn't just a medical issue, it's a financial breaking point. A single unexpected diagnosis can throw a stable family into complete crisis. Once you realize how vulnerable households are, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Americans are working more, yet ending up with less buying power than their parents ever had. And that's the center of everything. How can anyone afford a home, groceries, or health coverage when the value of work is collapsing in real time? For decades, productivity has risen, corporate profits have surged, executive pay has exploded, but everyday workers have been left behind. Over the past 5 years, wages rose about 14%. But the cost of basic necessities jumped 40 to 120%. That's not a small gap. That's a structural trap keeping millions of people under financial pressure no matter how many hours they work. Even good jobs no longer deliver the stability they once promised. Earning $30 to $35 an hour should support a comfortable life, but after taxes and deductions, many workers take home $3,200 to $3,400 a month. And that money disappears almost instantly because the essentials cost more than ever. Not because people mismanage their finances, but because modern salaries were built for an economy that doesn't exist anymore. Health insurance premiums alone can eat up $800 to $1,200. Before you even factor in rent, utilities, or groceries, the math is already broken. The rise of gig work doesn't help either. Millions have turned to side jobs, temporary contracts, or freelance gigs just to cover the gap their main job no longer fills. But these aren't stable incomes. They fluctuate constantly and come with zero benefits. It's not a sign of ambition. It's a sign of desperation. 2 incomes are now the absolute minimum for households that once lived comfortably on one. Meanwhile, paycheck deductions keep climbing. Required insurance, retirement contributions, rising state taxes, employer plans that offer less every year. Everything chips away at what workers actually take home. Salaries look higher on paper, but what people keep is shrinking. And that loops right back to the healthcare crisis. Medical bills would already be overwhelming on their own. Combine them with stagnant wages, and they become flat-out impossible. The U.S. economy now runs on a ridiculous premise: paying 2025 prices with 1990s wages. Working harder doesn't bring safety anymore. It only exposes how unfair the system has become. The middle class isn't falling behind because of poor choices. It's falling behind because wages simply don't keep up with the real cost of living. And when wages fall short, the pressure spreads far beyond housing and healthcare. It hits all the everyday necessities that quietly drain families month after month: childcare, energy bills, transportation. These are the costs no one can avoid, yet no one talks about enough. Childcare, for example, has become one of the most crushing expenses in the country. In many states, daycare for a toddler runs between $800 and $1,400 a month, often more expensive than rent. For a single parent taking home around $3,000 after taxes, almost nothing is left once childcare is paid. Even dual-income couples struggle, because this one cost alone can feel like a second mortgage. It's not a luxury. It's simply the price of being able to go to work. Energy bills have followed the same trajectory. And it's not because people are using more. Most families are actually cutting back. Yet their bills still rise because utility companies are passing the soaring industrial demand, especially from data centers, directly onto customers. A $150 or $180 bill has become $250, $300, even $350, even when people barely touch the thermostat. Then there's transportation. Car payments now range from $700 to $1,000 a month. Auto insurance is up 20 to 40% in many states. Add fuel and maintenance, and even keeping an older car on the road costs several $100s a month. Without a reliable vehicle, working is impossible, but owning one has become a financial burden all by itself. All these rising costs stem from the same core issue: wages that don't grow. When incomes stay flat while every essential expense climbs, saving becomes impossible. Planning becomes impossible. Even breathing financially becomes impossible. Childcare, transportation, and utilities may not grab headlines like housing or healthcare, but they quietly squeeze the middle class until there's nothing left. Every month becomes a balancing act, where one small mistake can push a family over the edge. And after covering all these unavoidable expenses, millions turn toward the safety nets meant to prevent collapse. That's when they discover the harsh truth: those safety nets don't match the world we live in anymore. They were built for an economy that disappeared long ago, and that gap is throwing millions of families into crisis. SNAP is the perfect example. Its eligibility rules are based on outdated assumptions from a time when rent, medical care, and basic essentials cost a fraction of what they do today. A family earning around $3,000 or $3,200 a month, barely enough to survive now, is often considered too wealthy to receive help. Picture a family that, on paper, earns enough not to qualify for assistance. Yet in reality, they're juggling overdrafts, living on credit, or skipping meals so the kids can eat first. That's the paradox of 2025. The benchmarks for aid no longer match the real cost of living. And when food programs are cut, the impact isn't limited to those losing benefits. The ripple effect hits the entire economy. SNAP money, for example, doesn't just sit idle. It flows straight into supermarkets, supply chains, and local businesses. So when millions lose eligibility or see their benefits reduced, demand drops, retailers panic, and to protect profits, they hike prices. Suddenly, a gallon of milk that cost $3 jumps to $5. Not because supplies are scarce, but because the purchasing power that stabilized prices has vanished. Meanwhile, the government insists these cuts are necessary to balance the budget. But at the same time, billions are spent on distant projects or foreign commitments while domestic programs shrink. The message is clear: the burden is being shifted onto those already teetering on the edge. Middle-class taxpayers fund these programs, yet many can't access them when they truly need help. And when aid decreases, they end up paying the difference anyway, through soaring grocery bills, rising local taxes, and mounting pressure on their communities. This scenario reflects a bigger reality. Stagnant wages, skyrocketing essential costs, and safety nets designed for a bygone era are now cracking. Millions fall, not because of poor life choices, but because the systems meant to protect them no longer match the economy in which they live. And when those safety nets weaken, another force steps in, not to help, but to extract every last dollar: corporate price power. Today, major American companies don't react to inflation. They create it. What we're witnessing isn't a cost crisis, it's a profit-driven inflation. Companies inflate prices far beyond their costs simply because they can. Look at the food industry. Kroger, PepsiCo, General Mills, Tyson, all reporting record profits while quietly raising the prices of essential goods. That box of cereal that went from $3.49 to $6.29? It's not the wheat. It's the shareholders. PepsiCo even admitted that price hikes weren't due to rising costs. Yet consumers are paying more than ever for the same products. Utilities follow the same pattern. Companies like Duke Energy, PG&E, and Con Edison raise rates in millions of households. A $160 bill becomes $250, sometimes $300. And often, these increases coincide with multi-billion-dollar profits. Consumers are told to cut back, but even when usage drops, bills keep climbing, offsetting the massive energy demands of data centers like AWS or Google Cloud. Health insurance is even worse. Blue Cross, United Health, Aetna, Cigna, all raising premiums 10%, 15%, sometimes more, while reducing coverage, denying claims, and hiking deductibles. United Health alone made over $22 billion in profit last year, largely from higher premiums and care denials. And this is where everything converges: shrinking public aid, rising prices, and mounting pressure. When programs like SNAP shrink, corporations tighten margins and raise prices to protect profits. Families are squeezed between disappearing public support and skyrocketing private costs. The system becomes a closed loop. Companies push prices up, the state steps back, and workers bear the brunt with wages that can't keep pace. Profit-driven inflation isn't just rising costs, it's proof that the American middle class has become the country's most lucrative resource. But the consequences don't stop at national borders. Forces driving prices up in the U.S. feed a global accessibility crisis. What looks like an American problem is actually part of a worldwide chain. Prices are rising faster than wages in nearly every major economy. Housing shortages, overloaded essential services, and middle-class families struggling. It's a repeating pattern. In Europe, Canada, Australia, Asia, the story is the same. Rents in London, Toronto, Sydney jump 30 to 50% in a few years. Home prices in Dublin, Vancouver, Singapore are so high that even six-figure earners can't buy a starter home. Energy costs in Germany have exploded. Food inflation in the UK is at a decades-long high. Canada's average house price tops $700,000. In Australia, multiple cities now require over $120,000 income just to rent comfortably. These parallel crises aren't coincidences. They stem from the same mechanisms: housing financialization, corporate consolidation, private land acquisitions, and multinational companies setting prices across global markets. When Blackstone or Vanguard buys entire neighborhoods in one country, rents rise elsewhere. When tech giants build new data centers, energy prices spike regionally. When food corporations hike prices, local markets follow suit. We no longer live in isolated economies. We live in an interconnected system where a few global players can influence costs everywhere at once. Affordability isn't collapsing in one country, it's crumbling across dozens simultaneously. And when the global middle class can't secure housing, healthcare, groceries, or basic stability, this isn't just an economic problem. It's a worldwide tipping point. When every major city becomes unaffordable at the same time, the crisis is no longer regional, it's universal. And a global crisis inevitably hits something deeper: our mental well-being. Rising prices, stagnant wages, vanishing stability, these aren't just financial issues. They're daily emotional burdens. The middle class no longer struggles just with numbers. They struggle with exhaustion, anxiety, and the constant sense of falling behind, no matter how hard they work. When home prices jump 40 to 60%, insurance premiums exceed $1,000, and bills climb even with reduced consumption, the brain switches into survival mode. This stress is no longer temporary. It becomes permanent. For millions, a single unexpected expense, a medical bill, a broken appliance, a missed paycheck, can tip everything over. Families delay children, forgo healthcare, work extra hours or side gigs, not out of ambition, but necessity. Weekends vanish. Family time shrinks. Sleep frays as endless calculations dominate the mind. What can we afford this month? What do we sacrifice? This is the silent collapse, mental fatigue, emotional burnout, the constant feeling of being overwhelmed. And the numbers confirm it. Over 60% of Americans now live paycheck to paycheck, even those earning over $100,000 a year. Credit card debt tops $1.3 trillion, a historic high. Savings rates are near record lows. These aren't just statistics, they're signs of a population living in constant financial fear. At the heart of it, multiplying costs, eroding public support, rising corporate power, and a global accessibility crisis. As prices climb everywhere and institutions shift risks onto citizens, the middle class loses something far more precious than money: control, direction, and certainty about the future. The psychological shock isn't collateral damage. It's the alarm bell. When millions exist in perpetual fight or flight mode, collapse is no longer just economic. It becomes human. And when this stress becomes permanent, the problem transcends the individual. It becomes national. A weakened middle class isn't just a social issue, it's the breaking point of America's economic model. The system depends on tens of millions of families buying homes, raising households, consuming, and fueling the economy. But today, that pillar is crumbling. When 60% of households live paycheck to paycheck and credit card debt surpasses $1.3 trillion, consumption, America's engine, falters. People buy only essentials, stores close, regional economies slow, and job markets weaken. A country without stability cannot thrive. Meanwhile, the national debt surpasses $38 trillion and keeps climbing. A shrinking middle class means lower tax revenue. A government collecting less has to borrow more to avoid stagnation, accelerating the spiral. You can't borrow indefinitely when the people funding the country are financially exhausted. Fewer households qualify for mortgages, so the housing market wobbles. Hospitals get buried under unpaid medical bills. Cities weaken as families leave expensive areas. Trust erodes as institutions appear to abandon those they were meant to support. Everything is connected: manipulated data, the rising cost of living, failing safety nets, corporate dominance, global shocks. Each piece strips stability from the middle class. Together, they create a country where social mobility is no longer the norm, it's the exception. The end isn't sudden. It's a slow erosion. A drift toward a future where opportunities shrink, inequality widens, and the very foundation that once made America strong becomes too fragile to hold. The collapse of the middle class doesn't just reshape the economy. It reshapes the nation's destiny.